we speak, right? I mean, that's your ride home from the movies right there. But also, when you think of iconic moments from the comics like this one, when Venom also tried to be a vigilante, right? And by the way, Venom himself is incredibly comics accurate in the film. It was a joy as a comic book fan to watch him in action. So cool. So when you think of that element, dark absurdist humor is definitely the way to go. And Ruben Fleischer with Zombieland on his resume, he's got a lot of bad movies on there too, but I put this in the same category as Zombieland, which, maybe, I don't want to give anything away. Zombieland, I don't want to give anything away. All right, so anyway, and then also when you have Tom Hardy in the mix, really committing to the role, well, they make for excellent Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, Liam Neeson stand-ins. Now, I'd also like to point out that the Evil Dead movies and Darkman are from the 80s, 90s, right? And Venom plays like one of those movies too, but just with much better VFX. It also plays like an episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series, which is also from the 90s. So if you can't appreciate that and be like, okay, if that's what we're doing, let's see you do it, then yeah, then you're a wet blanket, quite frankly. I mean, the first act, yeah, it's a bit rushed, right? The strokes, a bit too broad, but nobody's phoning it in here in front of or behind the camera. And it was frustrating because of that my audience of critics seemed to come ready and eager to laugh at the movie instead of with it. For instance, I'll give you an idea of the kind of audience I was seeing this with. Stan Lee has the cameo, and somebody a few seats over from me actually got angry that he was in the movie, saying like, Stan, how could you grace this piece of trash with your presence? And it's like, it's a Marvel movie. Of course Stan Lee's going to be in it. What's wrong with that? So that I thought was uncool. He even showed up in Teen Titans Go to the Movies. Stan Lee's got to eat. Stan Lee has a whole lot of drama going on. Don't pick on Stan Lee. And then also at the end of the movie, at the very, very end, they show like about 5 minutes of Into the Spider-Verse. It's stunning. But someone behind me, as I tweeted, said, just a dumb animated movie. And I'm like, all right, some of you responded with some great gifts to that situation. But as for laughing with this movie, make no mistake, the movie wants you to laugh, right? The absurdist reactions from the actors, the deadpan reactions from the actors, they're all totally intentional. I'll just give you one example. It's a little thing. Riz Ahmed is like being super weird, and villainy. He start to the point where he's starting to alarm his staff. And someone behind him kind of reacts to that over his shoulder. And I think the people in my audience laughed at it as if it was stupid. But it was a comedic situation. It was funny. I thought it was great. I loved it. I mean, I thought that character was that was like a bit character. I thought they were reacting appropriately to the situation, to be honest with you. Now, the interplay between Tom Hardy as Eddie and Tom Hardy as Venom is a heck of a lot of fun. I thought he was great. And the action sequences, too, get your blood pumping, with strong assists from the VFX team, especially, again, when Venom comes out to play. He looks so cool. And also composer Ludwig Göransson, fresh off of Black Panther. This guy's such a good composer. He's definitely somebody to watch. As for the rest of the cast, again, they all take their roles very seriously, which I appreciate as a comic book fan. I'm glad somebody was taking this movie, because the critics certainly weren't. Everybody in the cast fully committed to the absurdist, cartoonish tone of the movie, but not in a Jim Carrey way, as some of the comparisons I've seen. I felt, again, it was Sam Raimi, where while things are absurd and cartoonish, right, the characters in the movie are taking these things all very seriously because this crazy stuff is really happening. I mean, and it also had like a lot of great like one-liners like from 90s, like Sam Raimi, like those kind of movies too. I thought it was very true to that, I really feel Evil Dead meets Darkman is the best way to describe this movie. And then, well, of course, you would expect Riz Ahmed and Michelle Williams to stand out, and stand out they do. I think that Jenny Slate deserves a lot of credit for making her role as a scientist who develops a conscience not only pop, but resonate. She could have gone for, she struck just the perfect tone. I was very impressed. She walked that fine line between fitting in with the tone of the movie, but yet still taking her role seriously, really commendably. We will discuss the details in the spoiler review, of course, but for now, let me just say that after a very fun and surprising end credit sequence, there are two. There's one that's associated with the movie, and again, there's that Into the Spider-Verse preview. But I'm not only down for a sequel after that end credits tease, wow, and I'm also down for a Spider-Man interaction, but on top of all that, I think there's real potential here for Deadpool. I would bring Deadpool in here. And Deadpool also loves Spidey. So now that he's yours, lend him out, Disney. I think that is a movie that would be amazing, right? And I think if the Disney empire expanding and bringing on partners like Sony as they're doing doesn't result in I guess, that's the question. Will the Mouse House ever take risks? I don't know. I guess with the reaction to Venom, maybe they're like, see, that's why we don't do it. But I think a Venom, Spidey, Deadpool movie I think it would print money. We'll see how the audience reacts to Venom, because with Venom, the end of the Spider-Verse preview at the end, I had a really Spiderific time at the movies. And if you're into the Spider-Verse and old school Sam Raimi movies and old school comics, right? I think that you will too. But this movie's dividing people. It's dividing people for sure. So I'm very eager to hear your thoughts about it down below. But save those spoiler comments for the spoiler review. And of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.
After trains and coaches are decommissioned and are waiting to be scrapped, they are gathered together in a large section of unused railway tracks that come to be known as train graveyards. For urban explorers, they are a fascinating place to investigate, as there is so much history and old-fashioned machinery to be studied. Some of the graveyards are well-known tourist attractions and open to the public. They're allowed to walk through the train cars and sit down inside the locomotives, but most are more off of the grid, remote, forgotten, and extremely unsettling. Up in the region of Canada where I live, there is one such place. If you're willing to endure a few miles of hiking through the woods over uneven terrain, the trees open up to reveal an abandoned railway yard, with hundreds of older-style cars and engines compacted closely together, up and down the tracks. Everything is overgrown, with tall grass and small trees growing up from underneath the cars, and most of them are heavily weather-beaten and graffitied. Standing on the platform always gives you a sense of cold fascination because of how crowded the tracks are, yet how quiet it is. It's literally as close to standing in a ghost town as you can get. I would usually hike up there in late spring, when the snow is mostly gone, and wander around and detach myself from society. I would sketch the landscape sometime in my pad, or just stroll up and down the cars looking for lost treasures. Last time I was up there was a few weeks ago. It was late summer, which normally isn't when I choose to visit the station because of how hot it was. But I decided to break with tradition and make the hike one last time before the snow started. As I wandered down the railway tracks, casually dragging my fingers against the cars as I went, I noticed fresh fragments of glass on the ground. One of the safety glass windows in the car had been broken and was bent outwards. Curious as to what had caused the damage, I entered the train car and walked down the aisles. At the very end of the car, I noticed a sleeping bag and several empty food cans and wine bottles. Figuring a homeless person had made their home here, I decided to leave without touching anything. As I was exiting, I noticed a hole in the back of one of the seats. I bent over to have a better look. Something had punched a hole clean through the seat and traveled into the seat in front of it. I stood back straight up and continued glancing through the car. I spotted at least 5 fresh holes in the ceiling, the walls, and other seats. I glanced back at the broken window. Had someone fired a gun down this direction of the train, and then in a panic, climbed out through the opening in the window? I stood there about 2 or 3 minutes in silence, just looking around at the damage, trying to solve the puzzle that was before me. Maybe 2 homeless people were fighting over territory? I sat down in one of the old train seats and dug through my bag for my phone. I was going to power it up and start taking pictures of what I saw when I felt the faintest of chills when I heard a voice whisper directly in my ear, "Get away." I leapt up to my feet in an instant and actually spoke aloud. No fucking way. I glanced around in every direction and pulled out my hunting knife. I raised the knife and was frantically looking around, but there was absolutely no one there. I caught a glimpse of my hand and noticed how badly I was shaking. I swear by anything you want me to swear on, what happened next is the truth. Something shoved me in the chest, and again I heard someone speak directly into my ear. "Get away." I booked it. I ran out of the car and sprinted directly into the trees. I circled back and hid behind a tree to watch the car from what I thought was a safe vantage point. I didn't see anyone exit the train after me. There wasn't movement of any kind. Thoroughly shaken, I took the long way back around the station and headed back to the path that would take me home. I was already trying to convince myself that I had hallucinated the whole thing, and by no means was I ever going to tell anyone about it. The train station was still in sight when I paused. I took out my phone and began powering it on. I was going to record a video of myself explaining what had just happened and get a sense of how scared I looked, when, again, nothing but the truth. I heard footsteps coming up the path behind me. I paused, and maybe for about 15 to 20 seconds, I didn't make a sound. Then, the voice came again, though this time it was not in my ear. A voice screamed at me from down the path. "Get away!" I had never heard a voice so hollow yet so furious. I sprinted up the path for as long as I could, before I had to stop and catch my breath. I've been alive for more than 40 years, and I never recall being as scared as I was in that moment. Tone of voice can give a lot away. You can tell when someone is trying to scare you, and when someone is getting ready to hurt you. By the tone of the voice just then, it most definitely felt like the latter. I haven't been back to that station since, and to be honest, I really don't want to. I'm not even sure I could easily locate the exact car where I heard the whispers. I can only speculate as to what happened in that car. But my guess is someone tried to sleep in there, and during the night, the voice came and tried to get them to leave. The sleeping person, in a blind panic, likely fired some shots from a weapon, and then crawled out of the window in terror. If the voice had sounded like it did on the path, except in the dark, I likely would have reacted in that same way. "12 years ago, when I was 20, I had been married for 2 years and had 2 kids. I was a stay-at-home mom, and my husband worked as a landscaper. We lived in a double-wide modular home. One night I was home alone because the kids were visiting their grandmother, and I decided to relax and watch a movie. Our home was about a mile away from the nearest neighbor. It rested atop a large hill that was surrounded by a dense forest. I had barely started the movie when I heard what sounded like a kitten meowing outside.
Meow. Meow.
I got up and decided to investigate. I went outside and immediately noticed something wasn't right. The meowing sounded like it was coming from about 20 feet up in a large oak tree.
Meow.
When I walked over and stood directly underneath the branches, the meowing turned into a deep growling. Not like a dog, but someone pretending to be a dog. It was too dark out to see anything clearly. Deeply unsettled by this, I went back inside and locked the door. While I contemplated whether or not I would be overreacting by calling the cops, I heard a loud boom on my roof, followed by the most insane high-pitched scream I had ever heard. I covered my ears, ran to the bedroom and grabbed the shotgun. I was shaking with fear because I knew something or someone was intentionally trying to scare me, and it wasn't normal. You could just feel it in the air, that something was different. I called my husband at work, and just as he answered, the screech started again, only deeper and longer. He told me to hang up and call the police, but I knew they wouldn't be out there for at least an hour. So instead, I decided to stand facing the bay window with the shotgun up and ready. After a few moments, what looked like an emaciated teenager jumped down in front of the window, facing my direction. He had completely white glowing eyes, as well as white hair, and extremely pale skin. He looked up as if he was sniffing the air. Then he growled while glaring at me. His eyes seemed to get brighter as he did so. After another moment, he opened his mouth and revealed what appeared to be a forked tongue. Before I could even process what I was looking at, I heard more footsteps on the roof, and a smaller girl that looked just like him jumped down from above, also looking directly at me with glowing white eyes. I instinctively cocked back the hammer on the shotgun. I didn't want to shoot through the window if I could help it, but I wasn't going to let them get in. They pressed their faces to the window, and all I could think about was how silent it was all of a sudden, and how pulling the trigger would break the silence. I'm not sure how long we locked eyes, but I suddenly noticed a pair of headlights coming up the driveway, and I recognized my husband's car. I wanted to scream out to him not to get out of the car, but before I could even open my mouth, both white-eyed children leapt off of the roof and into the darkness. My husband never caught a glimpse of them, and ultimately didn't believe me. His mother did, and confided in me that she had seen them before. She believed that they were some kind of demon. Over the next few years before he moved away, I would occasionally hear meowing from the trees around my house at night, but I would never go out to investigate. I'm not sure what they were, but paranormal or not, I don't ever want to find out what they wanted from me. I'm a former employee of New York's Palace Theater in Times Square. To summarize, I worked as a lighting technician and stagehand, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the theater is very haunted. I know that's not exactly breaking news. The theater was built back in 1913, and it has a long history of unexplainable occurrences and ghostly sightings. Even today, in 2018, the advertisements claim it to be haunted by more than 100 spirits, both of previous performers and employees. I'm not sure how anyone can accurately judge that, given that any ghosts that reside there are never going to line up for a roll call. But regardless of how many there are, I can say with certainty that there is at least one, and he is very angry. I had a friend who used to work in the theater as a sound technician and would frequently sit in or near the orchestra pit during performances. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this place, the most well-known celebrity spirit that supposedly haunts the palace is Judy Garland, most well known as Dorothy from the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. That never made much sense to me, as she didn't die in the theater. In fact, she didn't even die in New York. But the theory goes that because she gave her last live performance in the theater in 1967, her spirit was drawn back to it because of the overwhelming sensation of feeling alive and happy there on stage. There was a door built especially for Garland in the orchestra pit for her to enter and exit the stage. My friend is one of several dozen people who have reported seeing her standing there during a live show. Normally it's just a, "I caught her out of the corner of my eye" kind of thing, but according to my friend, he had turned his head and made direct eye contact with her. She made an apologetic face as if to say, "Oh, I'm not on yet," then disappeared back through the open doorway. He said he was so shaken he collapsed into his seat and was unable to calm his breathing for several minutes. Now, as for my own accounts, I never saw Judy Garland or anyone else I recognized as a golden age film star. But I did see many figures walking up and down the aisles out of the corner of my eye. It happened so often that I stopped asking my coworkers if they had seen anything. I would just get used to it and ignore it. In fact, I recently went back to the theater in early 2017 with one of my friends to show him around. When we were under the stage, I caught movement of something walking alongside us out of my peripheral vision, but I wasn't even surprised or alarmed enough to turn my head. Back in 2010, I had one of the most heart-stopping experiences. It was late at night after hours. There were maybe 6 of us in the entire theater. The doors were all locked and most of the lights were out. I was up on one of the balconies immediately off stage. I had my radio in one hand and was speaking to my partner in the lighting booth. As he was adjusting the lighting on stage, I was getting a sense of how the show would look from this angle. The last thing a paying customer wanted was a light that was slightly out of focus and shining directly in their eye, or having something bright and shiny reflecting off the stage back at them. I stupidly had one foot up on the balcony railing and was mentally counting the lights, running down a checklist in my head. I was then violently shoved from behind. I distinctively remember 2 hands shoving me hard with the intention of knocking me forward over the balcony. Because of the position my body was in, I jolted forward kind of sideways and fell over on my side on the balcony, but not before my radio went flying over the edge into the viewing gallery below. As soon as I hit the balcony, there came a deafening scream from somewhere in the catwalks above the stage. The lights flickered, and over the radio I heard my friend in the lighting booth yell, "What on earth was that?" I jumped up, much more shaken than hurt. I ran downstairs and across the aisles until I found my radio. Everyone was frantically calling my name over and over, apparently unsure of what happened to me. When I checked in, they all asked who had screamed, and I replied that I had no idea, but that someone had just tried to shove me off of the balcony. We all then met in the security room and spent more than an hour playing back footage from multiple viewpoints, but we never caught a glimpse of a ghostly apparition. I have no idea what happened that night. I know that one of the ghosts that supposedly haunts the theater was a tightrope walker who fell to his death during a performance. That might explain the screaming, but not the shoving. I know the palace is a major tourist attraction, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from visiting there. But please be aware that after buying a ticket, you may just experience more than you bargained for.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
My name is Jeremy, and I live in California. Back when I was in 6th grade, I had a close friend. Let's call him Devin. Devin was a super energetic kid, and we would always laugh, joke around, and play ball at recess. Those were some of the best days until Devin, well, ruined it all. While I had a strong, healthy childhood and a great relationship with my mom and sister, Devin was not as fortunate. His mom was extremely irresponsible. She would frequently expose him to drug use, abusive boyfriends, and other horrific circumstances. Sometime in the month of May during the year this happened, Devin became prone to extreme stress. When I woke up, I found myself tied to a tree about 50 yards from the play area. My head had stopped bleeding, but was still pounding, and I looked around in a daze trying to figure out what happened and who had done this to me. I tried calling out, "Hey, this isn't funny. My head really hurts. You need to let me go to the nurse's office."
It's all your fault. You've always had the nice life I never did, and I'm going to fix that.
The person who walked around from behind the tree to face me turned out to be none other than Devin. I stopped struggling and heaved a sigh of relief, realizing this had to be a bad joke. When I asked him to untie me, he bent over and smiled a deranged, sickly grin. He then proceeded to rant about how much he hated me and was jealous of my life, and how I had a mother who appreciated me and didn't treat me like an inconvenience. It was then he pulled out a kitchen knife he stole from the cafeteria, and I looked on in pure terror as he licked the blade like some kind of fucking psycho. I began struggling with all my might to get free, but he had somehow gotten his hands on the climbing rope from the gym, and there was no way I was going to break free against it. He raised the knife and swung it down quickly, slashing my arm and nicking the rope. I began crying, which only seemed to make him more upset. He threatened that he would hurt me worse if I didn't shut up. I began kicking and thrashing my body weight around in terror, until the tear in the rope loosened enough for me to get free. I rushed Devin and pushed him down, and started running for the cafeteria, screaming my teacher's name at the top of my lungs. As I was running for my life, I could hear Devin about 10 feet behind me, keeping pace with my sprinting. Fortunately, my teacher heard my cries, and she witnessed Devin chasing me into the gym. Once we were indoors around other people, I thought I would be safe, but he lunged at me, and we hit the wood floor hard. My eyes widened, and I suddenly felt time begin to crawl as he put his knee into my back and raised the knife again. In that moment, I thought I would never see my mom or my sister again. But suddenly Devin was grabbed from behind by the gym teacher and restrained. We were then surrounded by kids looking at us dumbfounded. The cut on my arm still bleeding all over the floor. I was taken to the nurse's office and questioned by the police, and Devin was eventually expelled. The school stopped the word about me being attacked from getting out, for fear of bad publicity. I learned from that day that you never truly know someone until you see the hatred in their eyes. I never saw Devin again, but I hope he got the help he needed. This story contains elements of sexual abuse. I'm a 20-year-old woman, and my story takes place when I was about 8 years old in elementary school. I'm from Mesa, Arizona, and attended the same school from 1st to 6th grade. In the school I went to, it was a requirement to take music class every year. There was only one music teacher for every grade, and he had been teaching there for many years. He was a middle-aged man, heavy-set, with black and gray hair and a beard to match. I don't remember all the details of every situation that happened with him, since it was about a decade ago, but I do remember some really weird and specific things about him. I remember he was very talented with many instruments, and would often play some of them to impress the class. I also remember we had an activity we would do before class, where he would play music and would have everyone run, skip and hop around in a circle. He would go around and poke us while we ran around. He would do this thing if you were wearing shorts, a skirt, or ripped jeans with exposed knees. He would come up to you and tickle your knees and squeal,
"Naked knees, naked knees."
I always hated when he did that. He was my teacher every school year, and even though he always weirded me out, He never gave me that rapey pedo vibe. We had these little plastic recorders we would play sometimes in music class. It's like a small flute. The school provided white recorders for us, but I had my own black recorder at home. So being the unique kid I am, I brought mine in. My teacher was excited to see that I had my own, and even asked if he could see it. When he took it, he started to play on it. Quite skillfully. He handed it back to me, and I noticed it had his spit all over it. So I went to go clean it in the sink, but when I started to go over and wash it, he yelled at me and told me to leave it alone and to sit down. I emphasized that I wanted to clean it off, and again, he told me to leave it. So I refused to play my recorder, and he sent me to the office for not participating. A few years later in the 6th grade, I wanted to play the trumpet, so I decided to join band. And you can probably guess who the band teacher was. There were many occasions where he would pull up my shirt for me and tell me it was a little low cut for a young girl, or would touch my back, or again play my instrument and not want me to clean it afterwards. And if you play brass instruments, you know how gross that is. But I especially recall one incident that happened at band rehearsal. After the class ended, there were only a handful of students left, and a few parents left in the auditorium we practiced in. The teacher asked me to come with him into the music room to help him clean up, bring in chairs, instruments, etc. I brought some chairs into the room and helped put a few things away, but he then asked me if I could stay longer to help him clean up some more, even though everything was pretty much done. I don't really remember anything after that. Nothing at all, actually. I always thought I said no because my parents were here or something, but I honestly don't remember what happened. For years after that, I know I had a lot of issues that young girls shouldn't have. I suddenly became addicted to watching porn on my computer. I would make my dolls have sex with each other. And I started going to therapy after my mom found my Ken doll with the crotch completely melted. I don't remember being molested or raped, but I have read that traumatic memories can sometimes be blocked out and completely forgotten. Fast forward several years later, I got the news that my old music teacher had been arrested for child molestation. A girl I knew from my old band class came forward and said he had molested her in the band room when being asked to help clean. After she spoke up, a few other people came out with more allegations against him as well. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. I have links for the articles about his arrest. The article says attempted molestation, but he was eventually convicted. Mr. LaMonica, I don't know what you may have done to me, but I hope I never see you again. The article mentioned in this story can be found in the description. Keep in mind that I am a female, and this took place when I was 21. This encounter still scares me to this day. I used to work at a Subway, mostly during the night shift, and as some people know, some pretty interesting things are known to happen during the night shift. This particular shift was most definitely the worst. I was working alone during the closing shift one night. This old man who looked to be about 80 years old comes in and starts asking for a meatball sub, but asks in a very heavy Swedish dialect. So obviously I couldn't understand him very well. The language barrier seemed to irritate him, and he attempted to teach me a bit of Swedish for the sake of the order. I tolerated the short lesson and made small talk with him, as it's part of my job, and he pays for a sandwich and leaves. Nothing too bad, right? Wrong. He starts coming in every single night, even on nights that I didn't work, and would always ask for me. If I wasn't there, he would try to get my coworkers to give him my work schedule, and would only ever permit me to make his sandwiches. He would ask my coworkers to text me whenever he felt like telling me at any given moment. They would act like they were doing it, but what they were actually doing was texting me that he was there, and that they were getting pretty creeped out. Luckily for me, it was against Subway's policy to hand out people's work schedules or personal info. The instances where I actually was there, he would come in and get the same thing, but started telling me things like how pretty I was, and how if I was just a few years older, I would be his type. He would then proceed to share with me what he did to himself at home, while thinking of me, and the weird things he would do to his sandwich. These miserable attempts at flirting with me would continue for hours, even if I had other customers. Remember, this guy looked like he was over 80 years old. I told my manager about the situation, and she wasn't much help at all. She would just check the camera from her phone every couple of hours while she sat at home to make sure he wasn't bothering other customers, I guess. I eventually went to my area supervisor, and he said if this guy showed up again, I was to call the police. The following night he comes back in, but unfortunately I couldn't get to a phone. He had a crazed look in his eyes, and I was afraid of what might happen if I tried to do anything with him in front of me. So I just made his sandwich and told him that I had other things to do, and he had to leave so I can attend to my duties. He then thankfully left. I told my area supervisor again what happened, and he banned this man from the store. The next week, he comes by right as I'm locking up, and I struggle to hurry with the gate as he's talking to me. At this point, I'm visibly shaking, and I'm hoping he doesn't touch me as he was inches away from my face. He was so close to me that I swear I could smell what he ate the day before. I proceeded to tell him, "You have to leave me alone, sir. You've been banned from the store. If you don't leave, I'm gonna have to call the cops." He glares at me and says, "I see what kind of fucking person you are. You're just a fucking bitch, just like everyone else around here. I thought you were different." By this time, I had fastened the lock shut and started walking away when he shouts, "Oh, by the way, once you're done calling the police, why don't you go ahead and fucking kill yourself?" I ran to the car and called my mom and fiancé and told them what happened. After that, my fiancé walked me to and from my car and sat in the restaurant with me every night. I also started carrying a taser, a pocket knife, and pepper spray to protect myself at work. I won't go anywhere by myself anymore, and anytime I see someone that looks like him, I start to freak out and cry. About 3 months later, I left that job. I was too scared to be left alone anymore. I later found out that not only had he stalked me, but the female workers at Walmart as well. He would find out where their cars were parked and leave things he found in the garbage as gifts, along with creepy-ass love notes. I also found out that he would hop from subway to subway and do this to whatever female worker he chose. I hope I never see him again. Back in 1984, when I was practically still a baby, my parents were having a rough time making ends meet, since my parents thought it would be a genius idea to have 4 kids with no savings to speak of. They couldn't afford an apartment, so we had to move into a local motel with weekly rates. We lived there for about a year. My dad was the only one working, and my older sister was in 2nd grade at the time, so my mom was stuck tending 3 children under the age of 4 for most of the day on her own. I don't remember living there since I was so young, but I was told about the place more once I started growing up, which I assume was a reminder of how far we had come as a family. One morning when Dad was getting ready for work and Mom got my older sister ready for school, Mom noticed a shadow of a man against the pulled curtains of the bedroom. My mom is a notorious scaredy cat, so she hustled my sister toward the bathroom where my dad was, then hissed, "There's someone outside the window." My dad just kinda rolled his eyes at her, but looked out toward the front anyway to see if he could see anything. When he saw the shadow, his attitude changed. He snuck quietly but quickly across the room and opened the door. The man who had been standing outside the window immediately turned and ran off away from the motel into the street blindly. My dad narrowed his eyes at this retreating man and then closed the door, figuring if the guy was violent he would have started some shit instead of running away. He advised Mom to keep the curtains closed over the window and to stay home with the door locked until he got back later. Mom didn't want my dad to leave, but Dad reminded her that he had to, or else he wouldn't get paid for the day. So Mom reluctantly agreed and sent Dad and sister on their way. Later that afternoon, I was being an annoying little crybaby. So Mom instructed my older brother to play quietly with my younger sister and watch Sesame Street a while she tried to soothe me into a nap on the couch. My mom was sitting on the couch, patting my back, while I bawled my eyes out for no reason. When she glanced at the front window to see if there was anyone there, sure enough, there was. My mother freaked out, snatching me up from the couch, which caused me to cry even harder than I already was. She locked the three of us in the bathroom so she could call Dad at work, and then locked herself in with us. My dad skipped out of work and ran back home. When he got there, the guy was still standing at our window, with his hands cupped around his face, like he was trying to get a better look through the gap in the curtains. But my dad didn't even give the guy a warning. He just punched him in the head as soon as he got close enough. The guy stumbled away from the window in a daze, and Dad slapped him around, all the while yelling things like, "You think it's okay to scare people? You think it's okay to scare my wife and my kids? I'll show you what happens to fuckers who creep around windows." My dad hit him a few more times before the motel manager showed up and stopped him, thinking my dad was just beating up some random guy. The window creeper got away during the confusion, and he never came back. This story is told from the perspective of a female. I'm 33 years old, but this story took place when I was 18. I had this friend named Javier who lived across the street from my apartment building. We hung out a lot, and through him I met a guy named Jake. At first he came off as very charming, and we began dating. But after a short while I realized his sweet attitude was just a facade, and that he was a bit of a pothead. He also became violently jealous if he thought other guys were looking at me, and even told me that I wasn't allowed to go to the club because he didn't want guys hitting on me. Eventually he started harassing me for money to buy pot. He had never laid a hand on me until one day when he demanded money from me and I refused. Usually he would just whine like a little bratty child for hours until I relented and gave him cash to shut him up. But this time he decided to slam my head against the air conditioner in his room. I shoved him off and walked past him and out of his apartment, telling him that we were through. I was secretly relieved he had given me a reason to finally end it, because now I could go hang out at the club again with my friends. Skip ahead to that weekend, and I'm at the club. Jake shows up to harass me about breaking up with him. The bouncer noticed him and threw him out after Jake made a pitiful attempt to fight back. Every weekend after that, he tried getting back into the club, but was never allowed in. I heard through a male friend of mine that he was spreading rumors that I had an STD, and also asked a guy that I knew to hack into my computer and plant a virus. Then one weekend, this guy that I didn't know came up to me in the club and told me that Jake had given him a knife outside and told him to go inside and stab me because nobody leaves him. I should have called the cops, but I didn't, mostly because I was young and foolish and was determined not to be intimidated by him. I made sure my male friends would walk or drive me home and watch my back. Skip ahead a few months, and Jake disappears. Just like that, I stopped being harassed by him with no explanation, and I'm thrilled. I eventually hear through my friend Javier that he's been arrested. Apparently he and his friend have beaten a guy into a coma with a skateboard. Skip ahead 10 years later. I get a message on Facebook from him telling me that he's out of prison and asking me to get back together with him. He sees that I'm now married with kids, but regardless says that I should leave my husband to be with him, that he would take care of me and my kids. I thought, you think I would leave my husband for a crazy convict stalker? He tells me how his mother died and left him a place in Manhattan and that I should come live with him. And then without pausing to breathe, he asked me for nudes. Then I immediately blocked him. About 2 years later, my good friend Javier went missing in the Bronx. After leaving his brother's house, a few weeks later they found his body in the river. As far as I know, they never found out who killed him. Jake may have had nothing to do with it, but he's the only violent person I knew that Javier hung out with. Sadly, Javier left a daughter behind, who now has no dad. As far as I know, Jake is still wandering the streets of New York City. I've attached a link to a New York Post article reporting about the skateboard attack. I'm going to start this by saying I'm a pretty big nerd when it comes to anime. So naturally I love attending conventions while cosplaying. My husband and I had recently attended an anime convention, but unfortunately my experience was ruined when I encountered someone I had hoped to never see again. Thank God he didn't recognize me, but regardless, it brought back an awful memory I had managed to bury deep within my subconscious. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time of this chilling event, I was 15, and my friends and I were attending our very first convention. It was smaller than average, I suppose, but we didn't mind. We were just happy to take part in the experience. And while we met some great people, there was one person I had a confrontation with that will forever be burned into my memory. We decided on the first day of the convention to make sure and coordinate our cosplay outfits. We decided to dress up as Vocaloids, which are a group of anime hipster characters based of different tech software companies. No joke, Google them. So we were there exploring, taking pictures, and having a good time, when we see someone dressed as a fellow Vocaloid. Thinking, what are the chances? We decided to ask him if he would mind taking some pictures with us. He agreed with a good-natured smile, and we had someone take a few group pictures of us all together. Afterwards, we made some small talk with him, and he introduced himself as Patrick, and that he would introduce us to some other cosplay enthusiasts. We agreed because why not? That was kind of in the spirit of why we were all there. We met up with Patrick's friends shortly after, and they informed us that there would be a party in their hotel room later on, and that we were all invited. We reluctantly explained to them that we were underage. Patrick's friends then apologized for the misunderstanding, and told us that we would see them around the convention, and to have fun and stay safe. It seemed like they had a hard time convincing Patrick to leave with them, as he seemed to want to linger and talk to us, but eventually he begrudgingly made to leave our group and join his friends at their insistence. We told him goodbye, and that we would probably catch up with him tomorrow. It was getting late anyway, and what panels were still open were strictly 18 and older audiences. Patrick shrugged. Well, it's not like any of you haven't seen hentai before, so having an age limit is pretty much bullshit. He offered to buy us hentai books from the vendors if we decided we wanted some. We all were more embarrassed than flattered. He had a point, given that we all had experienced hentai graphic novels at some point. We told him goodnight, and we went back to our room without really fixating much on him. The next day we got an early start, and dressed up in different cosplay outfits. I decided to dress up as Lolita for the day. We bumped into Patrick downstairs, and he injected himself into our group again. We all were having such a good time that it took me a while to realize that he was constantly staring right at me, and not in a shy, subtle way either. Thinking that the bow of my outfit was crooked or my contacts were messed up, and I asked him if something was wrong with how I looked. He replied almost too quickly, "No, I guess I forgot to mention to you ladies that I'm a Lolicon fan, and you just look really cute." I felt myself blush and wondered just how hard of a Lolicon fan he was, or was he the type that looks at Lolita-themed porn? I eventually tried to brush off his statement and have some fun. After a short while, we made our way down to the vendors, and I ended up getting separated from my friends and found myself alone with Patrick. Suddenly feeling very vulnerable, I pulled out my phone to call my friends so we could regroup, when I realized my phone is dead. Swallowing my pride, I reluctantly asked him if I could borrow his. He told me his phone was up in his hotel room, and if I didn't mind, we could go up there together and get it. I replied I would just go back to my own room and plug in my phone instead. He seemed kinda irritated by my apprehension, and insisted that it would be quicker just to get the phone from his room. Being the dumb and trusting girl that I was at the time, I gave in, and we headed up to the room. On the way up, he started telling me about this hentai comic he read about an elementary school girl who lies to a lonely blind man about her age, telling him that she's in high school and willingly has sex with him, and they develop feelings for each other. I'm more than slightly creeped out by that, but it only got worse when he proceeded to tell me that he really got turned on by a certain scene involving the character I'm dressed up as in her comic, and wouldn't it be great if I could reenact it for him? Before I could think of an excuse to separate myself from him, we were outside his room. I told him that I would wait outside while he grabbed his phone, but he insisted on me coming into the room. Because it would only be a minute, it was easier just to accept than to argue, so I went in and stood right next to the door, while he went over to his bag on the bed and began digging around inside. While he was preoccupied, my eyes wandered around the room, trying to find anything I could use as a weapon, should I need one. I noticed a charger hanging out of a wall outlet, and I grabbed it. I figured I would lock myself in the bathroom, plug my phone in, and call for help. I told him that while he searched, I would use the restroom, and that I would be right back out. He then turned and looked at me with the most sadistic look I had ever seen, and asked me if I would just rather use him as a toilet instead. Without thinking twice, I sprinted out of there and back to my own hotel room. When I reached the room, my friends were already there waiting for me. They figured that my phone had died and that I would make my way back to charge it. I explained to them what happened and told them to avoid Patrick at all costs. We hung out in our room for a while to calm down and avoid bumping into Patrick for as long as possible. We eventually left the room a few hours later, sticking together as a tight-knit group, and eventually encountered Patrick's group of friends from the day before. When they asked us if we had seen Patrick recently, we lied and told them no. One of the women in the group informed us that we should steer clear of him because he seemed to have an unhealthy interest in young girls. We asked them why they were at the convention with him if he gave off bad vibes. They told us that they had been friends with him for a while and liked to keep an eye on him as best they could to prevent him from trying anything, but he would occasionally slip away. Out of sheer embarrassment, I didn't say anything to them about what happened. This guy Patrick apparently still goes to conventions in my state. I know this because my husband and I had bumped into him last year. I was relieved when he either didn't recognize me or didn't approach me due to my husband being with me. Either way, Patrick, I hope you haven't successfully baited any other girls into your room. I've never shared this story with anyone outside my immediate family. It may sound insane, but I promise it's the absolute truth. When I was 15, my parents and I moved to a newly constructed housing development in Beltsville, Maryland. We lived right on the end of a cul-de-sac, but our house was the only one that was completed. Granted, our lawn was just one giant patch of dirt, but we didn't mind. We loved the experience of living in a brand new house in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. All of the other houses around us still needed the finishing touches put on, such as windows and siding, so none of them were occupied. During the day, there were contractors all over the other properties hard at work, but at night, it was nice and quiet, and my parents and I would take long walks around the area and sneak peeks at the inside of the other empty houses. About a week after we moved in, I woke up at around 2 a.m. from an awful pain in my foot that turned out to be an ingrowing toenail. But I didn't know that at the time. I limped downstairs trying to find my Game Boy because I figured if I was going to stay awake and miserable, I might as well play some Pokemon Blue to make the time pass. I didn't turn on any lights on my way downstairs, and I found the Game Boy on the coffee table by the light of the street lamps outside. I walked back past the front door to head back upstairs when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye and paused. Next to our front door, we had a long window that gave us a perfect view of our porch outside and the driveway beyond. My mom had intended to put up a curtain, but hadn't got around to it yet. I stopped in my tracks and turned to look outside, and after squinting for a few seconds, my heart began to hammer inside my chest, and I'm sure my eyes went as big as stop signs. In the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. The only light I had to judge by was the street lamp at the end of the driveway, but there looked to be a figure of a man standing with his back to me, literally just off our porch, as if he had just stepped off of it. He seemed to be staring in the direction of the empty house across the street. That was scary enough, but what terrified me even more was how dead still he was standing. He wasn't even shifting his weight or fidgeting in any way I could make out. I blinked hard and tried to tell myself I was just seeing things, that it was a shadow or just my imagination. But when I opened my eyes again, I realized I wasn't crazy. The figure was definitely there. I should have cautiously made my way back upstairs and woke up my parents, but instead I did something very stupid. I'm not sure why I did it. I guess some part of me just wanted to try to make out if he was breathing, and I moved closer to the window and practically pressed my face to the glass. That's when the figure either heard me or felt my eyes on him, and his head spun around to face me, not his upper body, just his head jerking around to look over his shoulder, almost like an animal. In that moment, I saw two pale pinpricks of light staring directly back at me, and I just knew they were his eyes. I launched myself back from the window and screamed for my parents. I practically flew up the stairs and started wailing that there was a man on the front porch. My parents don't believe in guns, so when my dad saw the terror on my face, he grabbed the closest heavy object within reach, which happened to be a metal tubing attachment from the vacuum cleaner. He then made his way down the stairs. As I threw myself into my mom's arms, I heard my dad cursing and hollering. Then there was a moment of silence. We heard my dad drop the pipe, and when he called upstairs to my mom, his voice was terrified and desperate. "Call the cops! Do it now!" Now, my dad is a big guy, 6'4", and at the time easily 250. And back when I was a baby, he used to work part-time as a bouncer. But in that moment, he sounded frightened in a way I never thought possible. There came a hard pounding from outside the front door. I hid in my parents' closet while my mom called the cops. My dad was halfway up the stairs yelling at the guy just to leave, and that the police were coming. After what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably closer to 3, the pounding stopped. The police arrived maybe 10 minutes later and searched the entire property and the surrounding houses, but they couldn't find the man. I stayed upstairs while my mom and dad spoke to the officers in the driveway. The police did routine drive-bys for the next several nights, but as far as I know, they never found the man. I didn't get a good night's sleep for weeks. I kept remembering how the man's head had snapped around to face me, those pale eyes burning themselves permanently into my mind. It was several weeks later that my dad finally told me what scared him so much. When he had reached the bottom of the stairs, the man had his face pressed up to the window, and the knife was between his teeth. My dad dropped the vacuum pipe when he saw the tip of the knife impaled through the man's cheek. The man had then started tracing his blood against the outside of the window with his finger. After the police had arrived, they noticed streaks of blood all around the siding of our house, as if he had encircled it, continuing to run his bloody fingers across the outer walls. My family never took walks at night again, even after the other houses were eventually occupied, and to this day, I never ever peek out through the curtains at night, for fear I may see those eyes again. My story takes place in Lancaster, California back in 2007. I was 18 at the time and a senior in high school. I had picked up a job as a sign waver. You know, those people who stand outside on street corners waving promotional signs for businesses. Yeah, it sucks about as much as you think it does, but as a high school student it paid fairly well. By the way, Please stop throwing things at us from your cars while we're waving our signs. It's just not cool. The job is demeaning enough without having fast food launched at our heads. Anyway, I had been standing on my corner for about 2 hours swinging my sign around and waving at passing drivers when I noticed this bald guy sitting across the street from me on a bench looking my way. I waved to him more or less just to keep my rhythm going, and he immediately gave me the finger. It wasn't just a casual flip-off either. He raised his fist like he wanted to hit me and started shouting at me from across the intersection. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but the word faggot was definitely used at least once. I avoided eye contact with him and focused my attention on the cars again. Soon after, my boss pulled up to the curb and told me that I was free to leave as our company got laid off and all the sign wavers were going to be replaced by a different team. I was disappointed that I would be out of work for the foreseeable future, but in that moment I was relieved to be able to sit down somewhere out of the sun. I was about to tell my boss about the bald guy when I noticed that the bench across the street was empty. I'm not sure when he had left, but I simply shrugged it off and got into the car with my boss, who told me that my replacement was going to be there within an hour. Over the course of the next hour, I went home, got changed, and was meeting a friend for lunch before going to see a movie when the notifications on my phone started exploding non-stop, with people asking me if I was alright and to please call them. I was confused and immediately called my mom, who started crying when she heard my voice. I went home to be with her and immediately found out what all the concern had been about. The news was reporting that a sign waver had just been shot dead on the very corner I had been standing on less than an hour ago. When the victim had fallen, his sign had partially covered his face, and he hadn't had any identification on him. So most of my friends had jumped to the horrible conclusion that it was me lying there. The creepy thing was that the victim and I looked very similar. We were both Latino with short dark hair. We were about the same height, and even had been wearing nearly identical outfits. I was eventually interviewed by the police, and I mentioned the bald man who had been shouting angrily at me from across the street. But to the best of my knowledge, they concluded that the shooting was gang-related. Either way, the situation shook me, and I didn't feel safe or relaxed for a long while afterwards. I felt terrible that the other guy died, but at the same time, had my boss not come and picked me up when he did, who knows if it would have been me who was shot and killed. I have a wife and child now, and sometimes when I look at them, I think about how different everything could have been. I'm 17. I live in the city of Estonia in Europe. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any mistakes. It was 2 p.m., and I had just finished another boring school day. I had guitar lessons on Wednesday after school. I considered skipping the lesson and going back home, and lying to my parents that the teacher was sick and that there was no lesson today. But I decided to man up and just go to class anyway. That turned out to be a big mistake. I got to the entrance of the building, and I spotted a weird homeless guy wearing a red hooded jacket sitting cross-legged in a puddle in the middle of the parking lot. I stopped and stared at him for about a minute in confused fascination, but he didn't move once. It had rained the night before, and there were dozens of small puddles scattered around the parked cars, but it looked like he had intentionally gone out of his way to find the largest one in the lot to occupy. There were a couple of other people giving him sideways glances as they entered the building, but no one was saying anything. So I eventually just shrugged and made my way to my lesson. After 2.5 hours of sitting in the classroom, I had completely forgotten about him. As I left the building, I noticed, to my surprise, the man was still sitting there, and he hadn't moved a muscle. I was very creeped out, and I did something very stupid. I walked over to him, and once I got within 10 feet, I pulled out my phone, and like a smartass I said, "Hey man, don't move." I took a photo of him. I have since lost the photo because I had to change phones. After I took the picture, the guy made eye contact with me, and my heart skipped a beat. His head didn't move, just his eyes. The man's skin was extremely wrinkled and weather-beaten. His eyes were gray, and he had an incredibly long, unkempt beard, and he smelled like he had been living in a heap of garbage. His looks added to the way he was behaving, and it sent a chill up my spine. It was like he wasn't even human. I immediately took off at a brisk walk towards the sidewalk, not letting myself look back. I crossed the street and stopped at the opposite crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, my guitar case feeling twice as heavy as it usually did. I glanced back towards the parking lot, and my heart sank. The puddle man had stood up and was walking directly towards me. His eyes were staring at me intensely, and he didn't even bother to look both ways before he started crossing the street. I immediately called out an apology to him in Estonian, and again in Russian, but his expression didn't change. It was then I noticed that his clothes were dripping wet from sitting in the puddle, but it wasn't just a trail of water he was leaving behind him. He was bleeding heavily from both hands, or possibly his wrists, it was hard to tell, and he was leaving dark red pools on the concrete as he continued to walk towards me. I immediately dashed across the crosswalk without waiting for the light to change. In retrospect, I'm actually pretty lucky I didn't get hit by a car. I started running as fast as I could down the sidewalk without looking back. I know I should have just probably called the cops, but I was panicking and holding onto my guitar case with both hands. I didn't want to free one of my hands to use my phone for fear that it might slow me down. Every so often I would glance behind me and notice that the guy was still following me with long, determined strides. After about 5 minutes of running, lugging my guitar, I felt like I was going to collapse, but I still had another half-mile to go before I reached my apartment building, and the puddle man was closing in on me. Knowing that I was going to regret it later, I dropped the case on the sidewalk and just sprinted forward down the dark street as fast as I could go. I didn't look back. Once I got to my building, I ran up the stairs, down the hall, and ducked into my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I was gasping for air like I had nearly drowned, and my mother yelled at me from the kitchen for making so much noise. She asked me if I was okay, and I just nodded without responding. I don't know why I didn't tell her what happened, probably because she wouldn't have believed me and would have screamed at me for abandoning my guitar and would have made me go back to retrieve it. I simply told her that I left my guitar at school overnight and locked myself in my room until I was finally able to relax. The following morning I woke up at 6 to walk the dog and to get ready for school. This is the part I'm sure people are not going to believe, but I promise you it's the truth. When I opened my apartment door, I gasped and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. My guitar case was sitting just outside the door and had dried, crusted blood all over the handle. That was terrifying enough, but what freaked me out even more was the outside doorknob was covered in dried blood as well. My guitar case doesn't have a tag or anything on it with my name or address. I have absolutely no idea how he found out where I lived. I immediately washed the blood off the knob and the handle, and I never told anyone, not the school, not the police, and definitely not my parents. I stopped going to my guitar lessons after that. I haven't seen the puddle man since, but sometimes I lie awake at night in fear, knowing that he knows where I live, and that he's already tried to get in once. Thank God I locked the door that night. 4 years ago, I was finally able to move to a big city, one I had wanted to live in all my life. I had just turned 23, had a well-paying job, and many of my friends already lived there. I rented out a shabby studio apartment and got myself a cat. I was absolutely in love with the city. For a while. It all started at a punk show in an unkept dive bar, penis doodles on the walls, sticker toilets, my natural habitat. I had been drinking heavily and got very sociable, made the rounds to greet my group of friends, got free birthday beers, and had a great time. I stood right at the stage for most of the show because the band was genuinely amazing. It took me a while to notice the tall skinhead guy standing about 5 feet from me. He was very tall, not fat or skinny. Maybe broad is the right word. He had a shaven head, boots and braces and all that. I didn't pay much attention to him as I was focused on the band. During my cigarette breaks and while watching the band, I noticed he was always sort of nearby, but I assumed he must be socializing with common friends. At one point I was standing in front of the stage, and a mosh pit had formed behind me. He was in it, and whenever he circled back around me, he would sort of shove me, attempting to get me in the pit, but I didn't join because I was wasted and knew I would get hurt if I did. The show ended and everyone was saying their goodbyes when I realized I lost my bus pass. It was too far to walk home, and none of my friends would let me crash at their place. I was in the middle of begging my friends for a ride or bus money when the skinhead guy approached me saying that he could drive me home. He was clearly intoxicated, and I knew I shouldn't ride with a drunk driver, but so was I, and it was raining, and I never made the best decisions. While in the car, I got my first good look at his face. He wasn't ugly, but it looked like he could pass for 35 or 40. He drove surprisingly well and got me home safe. At the apartments, he asked if he could hang out inside. I told him no, that my cat doesn't like strangers. He seemed fine with it and told me goodnight and left. Exactly 1 week later, I discovered flowers at my front door. There was no indication of who had sent them, but I hate flowers, so I threw them away. A few weeks later, he called me. Apparently, he got my number from a friend. He asked me if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend. I was really creeped out by this. I wasn't used to men hitting on me or being so direct. I declined, saying that I had to work that weekend, which wasn't true. That weekend, I went to a house show. There were no other skinheads attending the show, so I thought he wouldn't be there. But of course, he was. I avoided him for most of the night and tried having a good time. When I realized this guy had done nothing wrong to me, he had been nothing but nice and helpful, he just had a crush. So why was I being so cold to him and getting so creeped out? I decided to say hi to him and be friendly. He acted friendly back, and we shared some whiskey and chatted. At one point, he put his arm around my waist, and people teased us for looking so sappy. Around 3 a.m., the party died down, and everyone either left or passed out around the house. I was outside smoking on the front curb when he came out and bummed a smoke off me. He seemed kind of angry with me out of nowhere,